I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He's the author of several books, no other than Mr. Cody Engdahl.
Hello, Daniel. It's wonderful to be back with you, my friend, and all your fantastic listeners. I'm glad to be hanging out with you guys.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Cody. Last week we talked about Mexico, my love. So, can we do the recap?
Sure. So, my name is Cody C. Engdahl. I am a historical novelist, and I have four novels that are out right now on Amazon, and they're on Kindle and paperback and hardcover. The My first series that we're going to start, we'll talk about that tonight, is my Civil War trilogy, and then I have a prequel, and we talked about the prequel last week, which was Mexico, My Love, and that's a story of the main character from the Civil War trilogy, his parents, how they meet, fall in love, run away together, and end up in the Mexican American War. So today we'll talk about my first book, Rampage on the River, the Battle for Island Number 10, which really kicks off the whole thing.
Wow, interesting indeed. So, what behind the rampage on the river, the battle for island number 10?
Yes, sir. So that is my first novel ever, and it's got, I love all my novels. I'm very happy with them all. I'm very proud of this one because this was the very first book I ever wrote. It's or at least the first novel I ever wrote, and I spent like a lot of aspiring writers, I spent most of my life thinking that one day I would write. And I got to a point in my life where I said, you know what, if I don't start writing now, I'm never going to do it. So I sat down and I started writing this book. And my idea was I'm a big fan of historical fiction. I like almost any kind of historical period, military history, anything from Romans all the way up to like Vietnam and even Space Marines. But I decided to write about the American Civil War because it was it has a big audience. There's a big fan base for the American Civil War. There's an enormous amount of research already done. So finding sources. In fact, most of the soldiers that fought in the war were literate and wrote home and wrote diaries. So there's tons of firsthand accounts. And also, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, which is part of the South. And so there were battles, actual Civil War battles, all around where I live.
So, according to Mr. Billy Ray Chitwood, well done, Mr. Cody. I love this comment. And ever since I was a kid, I knew that my great grandfather, James Dalmazo Malin, was involved in the Battle of Vicksburg. How did you craft it?
Yeah, so when I first started doing this, I wanted to kind of base this up. First of all, I want to say my great great grandfather was also at the Battle of Vicksburg. And it's a neat thing to connect with readers. I get so many people who write me, well, not letters, but they write me emails and Facebook messages and say how much they love my book. And then they tell me about their own ancestor that fought in the war. Um, I wanted to write something that was similar to my experience. So I am from Detroit. I joined the army and I ended up in Nashville. So I used that as kind of the way I would write this, basically the trilogy. So I picked a regiment, the Second Michigan Cavalry, and I started researching them, and I decided to write a trilogy based off of their career in the war. Because what was really important to me was not only to write a very exciting swashbuckling adventure, but to have it rooted in real history. So each book in the trilogy ends with a major battle in which the Second Michigan Cavalry takes participates in. And so for the first book, Rampage on the River, the Battle for Island Number 10, it ends with the Battle of Island Number 10, which is a very important battle. and it's an important strategic battle, but it's one that a lot of people, even Civil War buffs, don't know a whole lot about. And so it was fascinating to write about it. There's a lot of great accounts, and I was able to get a lot of the great history that took place with that battle, plus write my own story that was adventurous and it had heroes and villains that were really on both sides of the conflict.
Oh, that's interesting indeed, Mr. Cody. So this is your debut novel.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it kicks off the whole trilogy. And I gotta say, I'm very proud of it because I had a lot of I was thinking ahead when I wrote it. So when you read the very first chapter, there's so much in that first chapter that is setting up the whole, not just the book, but the whole trilogy and the prequel. It starts off with friends saying goodbye to each other at a train station in Detroit, and because one of the friends is from the South, he's from Tennessee, and he's going home because the war has started, and he's going home to fight for the Confederacy. So his friends from the North are saying goodbye to him, and after he leaves, we get introduced to one of the various, a, kind of a villain, but also in some ways a friend. We are introduced to Klaus, who is the son of a German immigrant, and Klaus doesn't like the main character Carl because Klaus found out that Carl was kissing his sister the night before and demands to have a duel.
Oh, intrigue.
Yeah, yeah, I'll tell you something, Daniel. I grew up a child in love with swashbuckling movies, and so my dad got me a racetrack as a kid, and I wasn't interested in cars. I used the parts of the racetrack to make swords instead. My dad.
uh,
So we have this great duel, but it goes kind of wrong, and it ends up with Carl being thrown in jail. I was just gonna say he goes to jail, and he is basically given the choice of either you're gonna go to prison or you must join the army.
oh, yes. And according to NR, wonderful novel, wonderful historical fiction about the American Civil War. Oh, congratulations, Mr. Cody.
Thank you.
And what are the elements that you put in the story that make this novel wonderful?
First of all, like I said, I put a lot of real history in it, but I also told a very human story, and I wrote characters. I have characters who are fully in on the Confederate side, in their point of view. I got characters that are from the North who, and in it, I think what's really interesting about it is, we've talked about Alexander Dumas. We're both fans, and
Yes.
one thing I love about Dumas, when you read the Musketeers, after the first novel, these guys stay friends for the rest of their lives, but they end up on opposite sides of conflicts. And sometimes they have to come back together and forget their animosity towards each other. And so I wanted to tell a story about that, about two kids, Carl and Kyle, who end up on opposite sides in different uniforms, supposed to be fighting together. But I created a story in which they end up crossing paths and then having to go on an adventure together. They have to work together to, I don't want to give away too much, but to save someone who's very dear, who becomes an important character throughout the entire trilogy. So I like that aspect of like friends who become enemies who must now come back together and work together, and because ultimately their friendship is more important than politics or war.
Indeed, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, I want to shout out to the people listening in Italy. Thank
Mm.
you so much for supporting this podcast. And Piedmont, I got
Mm.
48%. Latham, I don't know if I pronounced correct, but I get 29%. Lombardy at 8%. Tuscany at 4%. Emilia Romana 3%, Aquila at 3%, Trentino Alto Adige at 2%, Veneto at 2%, Campania at 1%, Sicily, Calabria and last but not least, Friuli, Venetia, Giulia. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast.
Yes, and I would like to say, now that we mentioned Italy, um, the American Civil War has a fan base all over the world. There are people who are, it's a hobby, and there are people who study everywhere. And one of the things that's very popular is reenactments, where people wear the uniforms of the Confederates or they wear the uniforms of the Yankees and they reenact battles. And Daniel, there is a group, a reenactment group in Italy that
Yes.
does American Civil War. And these
Oh,
guys, yes, they're Italians, and I swear I follow one of the groups that's from Italy, and they put up pictures on Facebook that it looks like a movie. I mean, they do such a good job over there. So if you're an Italian listener and you're one of those reenactors, my hats off to you. You guys are doing a great job. And I've had people buy. I've had book sales in Italy too, like the Civil War over there. Yeah, absolutely.
definitely. Grazie mille tutto, Italiano.
Grazie. Yeah.
Italiano vero. Mr. Cody, what will be the best highlight of Rampage on the river? The battle for island number 10.
You know, there's so many crazy things that happened during that campaign that I had to put at the end of it a author's note or a historical note to explain some of the things, because there'll be things in the book that you're like, no way, that didn't happen, and sure enough, it did. Like, for example, on the night where Carl has his second duel with Klaus, I like to have sword fights in my all my books. He a tornado ripped through both camps, and in the on the Union side, it threw a tree into a tent, and it I think it killed an enlisted man and a lieutenant, and trapped a bunch of other guys that they had to lift the tree off. It also went across the river and flipped over one of the Confederate boats and did damage over there as well. And just one of those crazy things. Another really interesting historical event was the only time that an airship was used in the Western Theater. There was a German aeronaut who brought out a hot air balloon that the Yankees used for surveillance, because they were directing their mortar fire by sending observers up into a hot air balloon who could observe to see where their mortar shells were falling. Very interesting things, and the battle itself is fascinating. So, as you probably know, and if you're not familiar with American geography, the Mississippi River is one of the biggest rivers in the world. It's like as big as the Nile, um,
Yes.
and it cuts America in half, and it is an important highway in the 19th century for sending troops and supplies up and down. And at the beginning of the war, this is a major highway for the Confederacy, and the Yankees the Northerners are trying to invade the South, and if and there's a place in the river right where like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri all kind of meet, where the river does a 180-degree turn, goes 9 miles north, and then does another 180-degree turn and goes down south. So island number 10 was a small island. It was about a mile long, which is, I think, 1.6 kilometers for you, my Canadian friends out there, and about a half a mile wide, which I can't do the conversion.
No
but
worries.
um, but it was it was right in the bend of the river. So the Confederates, to keep the Federal warships from coming down the river and invading the South, they used that island as they fortified it with cannons, so that any kind of Yankee force coming down the river would have to go through a gauntlet of fire. And so, in order for the Federals to be able to invade the South through the Mississippi River, they had to go and take out the guns at Island Number 10. And so that's what this whole that's the historical plot to the whole battle. Um, and there's a warship called the Carondelet, and it's towards the height where they decided to do a night run past the guns at island number 10. I have the real depiction of that, the running of the Carondelet past those guns. It's a nail biting scene. I think it's very exciting. I think the readers will really get a kick out of it.
Yes, and according to Miss Brianna Weatherman, amazing book. So, what the difference of being amazing and wonderful?
I think what I write a lot about is, when a lot of people write historical, military, and action adventures, and the characters are super tough and they're really good at fighting and all that. I didn't write my characters that way. My main character, Carl, he's scared, and he's not great at fighting either. I mean, he's pretty good with a sword, but he's in over his head. And I really liked the idea of having my characters overwhelmed and scared all the time, and the situation they're thrown into, it seems overwhelming to them. And what was important to me was to have a lot of emotional context to everything going on, and to give emotional context to the motives of the characters and why they do things. And it's got everything in it. It's got romance in it. There's a great tension between Carl, the main character, and Catherine, who is the sister of his friend Kyle, and she's a Southern belle, and she's kind of tough, and he's in love with her, and she may or may not be using him because of that.
So, let's talk about the main character of your
Sure.
novel.
Yeah, so Carl, and there's kind of several. It's got a good cast of characters that have their own motives and reasons, but I would say Carl probably ends up being the main character of the series. And he grows up with just his mom in Detroit. In the beginning, we set up a mystery that Carl was raised without a father, and he doesn't know much about his real father. All he knows is that his father died in the Mexican American War, and that's all he really knows. And it's kind of a secret. And he knows that he and his mom have lived in this townhouse in Detroit, and that there's some family somewhere in Michigan that he never gets to see, that has money, and they pay for them to live there, and they pay for him to go to a university and private school. And he gets raised as a young gentleman, but he never meets any of his family. He doesn't know the story of his father. So he's confused about these things. He's kind of a slacker. He loves girls. He wants to go to school and be a lawyer, but the environment around him, the war starts, and things out of his control kind of throw him into this life that he didn't really ask for. But along the way, even though he's not really gung ho about the war, and he's not really that brave, he finds bravery. And I think that's what I like about him, is that he's kind of pulled in against his will, but when it's all about honor, Daniel. And when the chips are on the table, Carl is going to do the right thing, even though he doesn't really want to.
Yes, interesting, Mr. Cody. So if there are positive review, let's talk about the negative review.
Sure.
According to Mr. Peter Harris, nicely written, but the plot is so unbelievable.
Like I said, there are things that happen in it that really happened. And I had someone say to me, when they read the scene about the tornado, they're like, "Okay, come on now." And then they went to the back to the historical note, and they're like, "Holy cow, that really did happen." And I always say this: if you read one of my books and you find something in it that seems kind of odd and very specific, that's probably because it really happened. So I try to keep my books as close to the real history as possible, but also have my own plot in it. Now, I will say this, okay? Even though I base my books off of real history and all the historical aspects and historical characters are true, I am a romantic, and I write swashbuckling action adventures. Do I romanticize things a little bit? Yeah, yeah, I probably do. I'm a romantic, but I also want people to know and understand that war is a terrible thing. So I feel like there's a fine line between depicting history the way it was, making sure that people know that war is not a great thing, but also I'm writing escapist fantasy. I'm writing, it's not fantasy, but it's romantic. I want, when I write, I want you to wish you could be there too on that adventure. When you watch Star Wars and you want to be on the Millennium Falcon with Han Solo and Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker, fighting off the Empire. I want you to have that same feeling when you're reading my books.
Yes, people. Support Mr. Cody. Rampage on the River, the battle for Island number 10. What did you learn from it as your debut novel?
You asked me before about if I'm a engineer or a gardener.
Yes.
And which is a great question. And I'm somewhere right in the middle of those two things. And what is interesting is, and I wish I had a record of how things changed over time, because a lot of it was planned out, but a lot of it was discovery. Because when I start writing a book, I have a basic idea. I know how I want it to end. I know how I want it to start. But there were things in there that I was compelled to add as I went and made the story more complex. There's a whole. At first, it was going to be a simple story about just a guy who joins the army, goes through training, and then fights a battle. But I put in a subplot about a runaway slave in chapter 4, and I don't want to give too much away because this character Elijah is going to be an important character throughout the trilogy. But it really changed the plot, because it's really where and this is my first book, of course. It's really where I started with this idea of having dual plot books. There's the historical plot, which is the Federals are trying to take island number 10 so they can invade the South through the river, and the 2nd Michigan Cavalry is there to do that. But then I created this plot that starts with this runaway and turns into this big adventure.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. So before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, on our 3rd season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chefs in one of the best restaurants in downtown Toronto. So please do listen, support us, and listen to our latest episode about tomato sauce. So, Mr. Cody, can you please invite our listeners to buy all your books?
Yes, please. Please come and visit my author's page on Amazon.com. You can just look up my name, Cody C. Engdahl. That's ENGD as in David AHL. My first book is Rampage on the River, and that will get you started. I will tell you this: starting on Tuesday, July the 4th, in the UK, the 3rd book of that trilogy, Blood for Blood at Nashville, is only going to be 99 pence in the UK. So if you want a deal in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, there you go, 99 cents for book 3.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Cody Engdahl, because if you support him, he will give his best to produce more books.
I promise you that. I promise you that.
Yes, especially historical novel. What do you think, Mr. Cody, in the future you can create a novel that's not associated with history?
Yeah, most of I have a book that goes all the way up, a book that I started writing in the 90s that it's kind of a religious satire, and it's going to take place in the 90s. I have some ideas for a sci-fi, but I'm mostly a historical guy. I like swashbuckling adventures. We'll see. Right now I'm writing a book about the Austro-Prussian War, and it's Carl. It belongs to this series, but it's after the Civil War, and it's him going to Germany and getting involved in that war, the Austro-Prussian.
Yes. So, what is your inspiring message for those aspiring writers out there that they want to publish their books?
Hey, I'm glad you asked this. I'm very proud of this, by the way. I wrote a book called, I can't remember exactly, something like How to Write, Edit, and Market Your Book, or How to Write, Publish, and Market Your Book. And I sell it for like $1.99 the ebook, and I think the print book's like under $5. And it's just a series of articles. And I wrote in it, hey, if you read this book and you publish a book because of it, let me know. And I got a message from someone today, and he had read my book, and because he read my book, he followed my instructions, and he published the book. And he had a question for me, a kind of a technical question about marketing it. And I was like, absolutely. I answered it. And I also told him, hey, look, I have a Facebook group called Engdahl House of Readers and Writers. And I said, I want you to go post your book in that group. Please, please do so. It's really important to me to help other writers, whether you're just starting or you're a complete pro. I personally am always reading a novel. People say that they only write, they don't read, are fooling themselves. So, so I constantly am reading other people's novels. I just read Rob Steiner's The Muses of Roma, which is a great book. I wrote a great review for it, and I shared it on all my social media, my review. And now I'm reading Casey Ashman's book. It's a book about the Crusades. So yeah, I think what I would say to aspiring writers is just do the work. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be immensely creative. You just have to be willing to do the work. Sit down, plot out a book, write a little bit every day, and then write, rewrite, review, have someone help you edit the book, get it published, and market it, and start writing the next one. Anybody can do it. You just have to have the will to sit down and do it.
Yes, dedication and passion, people.
Yes, absolutely.
Probably you are one of the best in the making, like Mr. Cody and Alexander Dumas.
Yes, I am the spiritual son of Alexander Dumas.
Oh, that'd be awesome. And thank you for your talent, Mr. Cody. And once again, invite our listeners to buy Rampage on the River.
Yeah, come out, check out Rampage on the River. It's my first book. It'll introduce you to the characters and get you started. And I will say this, I'm very proud of it. I have great read-through, meaning when I look at my sales and my my Kindle Unlimited reads, people, they buy the first book, they read it, they come right back and they buy the second book, which picks up where the first book leaves off. They buy the third, they buy the fourth. So I'm very lucky because my readers, usually if they read the first one, they say it's a pretty fast read because I'm an action adventure writer, so I don't waste your time. We get the ball rolling. There's action happening in almost every chapter, and I think ultimately my first goal number one is to be entertaining. So I want you to read my book and have a good time. Number two is I want to make sure that I'm giving you correct information so that it's a big responsibility because you may never read about the Battle of 10 outside of my novel. So I had to make sure that the historical story you get is accurate. And so that when you read my book, not only you have a good time, but you also know a little bit more about the American Civil War.
Definitely, people learning as you're reading the novel of Mr. Cody. Thank you for your time, Mr. Cody.
Thank you, sir. We'll talk to you next week.
Welcome, people. See you soon.